This last decade in gaming has been nothing short of incredible. There's a myriad of titles that have come out and told amazing stories, subverted genres, and flat out raised the middle finger to our preconceived notions of what exactly a video game is. Since the end of the decade has come and gone now, I thought it might be appropriate to take a step back and consider what exactly these last 10 years of gaming has left us with, and to try my hand at making a new kind of video to potentially start a discussion. I started thinking of what my favorite games from the past decade were and figured, what the fuck, let's make a list. Which was absolutely easier said than done. Now, I don't have footage for all of the games that appear on the list. I played them a long time ago, way before this channel even existed, so I got cutscenes for them, and those will have to do. I'm gonna try my best not to spoil too much, besides mechanics in games where that's possible, but keep in mind that some of the twists in these games are what elevate them from good games to amazing games. I'll give spoiler warnings when appropriate. This content is not suitable for children. But, with that being said, let's just jump in with number 10. I'm going to start off with what might be a controversial opinion, but Halo Reach is probably my second favorite game in the Halo series, second only to Halo 3. But, unfortunately for Halo 3, it didn't come out this decade. Halo Reach came out in 2010, and so it qualifies for the list. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a sucker for prequels, so when I first heard that this game was gonna take place before the events of Halo Combat Evolved, I was immediately in. That being said, I wasn't expecting to love this game as much as I do, and I fucking love this game. When I saw that the Master Chief Collection was available on Steam, this was the first game that came to mind. This was the first Collector's Edition game I ever owned, and I definitely don't regret that purchase even though the game got stolen and all I was left with was a fancy case and a book. So, like I was saying, Halo Reach takes place before the events of Combat Evolved, and the story follows Noble Team, an elite UNSC Special Ops group comprised entirely of Spartans. We play through the game as Noble 6, the only unnamed Spartan in the group. Something about being on a team of these legendary warriors just takes this to another level for me. You hear so much about the prestige of the Spartan program throughout the Halo series, and Master Chief is, as far as we know, the last Spartan. So, knowing all of the things that he's capable of on his own, and seeing a team comprised of these incredible fighters got me more pumped than I'd been in a real long time. But now, to get into what makes the game better, I've got to get into spoiler territory, so if you don't want any spoilers for Halo Reach, head on over to the timecode on the screen right now. Do it. I'll fucking shank you. In Halo Reach, you're doomed to fail from the get-go. I know for some people that might be detrimental, but I actually really love that aspect of it, and I think that Bungie pulled off this story beautifully. You get connected to this cast of wonderful characters that you know will ultimately die, and despite that, you still manage to get attached to them. The way this game subverts your expectations of the typical hero story with such brutality is both touching and absolutely gut-wrenching. George sacrifices himself blowing up Covenant ship, only to have dozens more warp in immediately after. Kat gets shot in the head when you're running to shelter to avoid death in a city being glassed. Carter dive bombs his Pelican into a Scarab, knowing full well he's gonna die doing so. And then when you and Emil are the only ones left, Emil's in a big old gun, shooting Covenant ships down to let everybody else get the fuck off planet, and he gets stabbed with an energy sword. And then your character, Noble 6, completes that mission, but then is left stranded on the planet, the only human left, fighting off the Covenant in fucking hordes as they come at him, until eventually he dies. Or, goes MIA according to the official lore. Every one of those deaths hits like a truck, because in every instance, those deaths are ultimately meaningless in the immediate story. The only survivor of the cast is June, and even then, he dies later in the books protecting Halsey. But this is where the beauty of the Halo series shines. Sure, in this one game, those actions are meaningless. All of these characters die, and all of their deaths are met with the Covenant taking away all meaning behind them. But you know from having played all of the other Halo games that theirs is the most important sacrifice to have happened in the entire series. Were it not for them, Master Chief wouldn't have gotten off planet, he wouldn't have been able to do all of the stuff he does in every one of the other games. Humanity's redemption and salvation ultimately kind of boils down to the Noble team when you really think about it. So you take a story like that and you top it off with the razor-sharp gameplay Halo has always had and some of the best multiplayer, local or online, that any game has ever had, and you have untold hours of non-stop fun. There's never a moment when I am playing this game where I'm not just having a ridiculous amount of fun, whether it's playing through the story, playing online, or just sitting down on the couch with a group of friends and just fucking laying into each other. There's rarely a moment with this game where I don't have a huge smile plastered on my face, and for that reason, it gets a well-deserved spot in my top 10 games of the decade. You know what sounds amazing? Taking the Wild West and combining that with Grand Theft Auto. That's just an incredible idea in concept, but Rockstar Games didn't just knock this one out of the park, they landed the goddamn ball on the moon. The story follows protagonist John Marston, a former outlaw who was taken from his family by the Bureau of Investigation that will only grant him amnesty when he brings the members of his old gang to justice. Right off the bat, you feel like a badass, because that's exactly what John is, a badass. He's your stereotypical gunslinging Western outlaw, and my god is that a fun thing to play as. Lassoing people from horseback and dragging them for miles, beating someone senseless, tying them up, tossing them on the back of your horse and bringing them in for your bounty. Okay, maybe this game kind of sort of brings out my sadistic side, but it's supposed to! You're not playing as a cop that needs to follow the rules, you're playing an outlaw who was recruited specifically because the Bureau knows you won't follow the rules. The gunplay, the horseback riding, the hunting, hell, even the minigames are great. I spent probably 20 hours of my time in this game just playing Liar's Dice. That one minigame. I don't have my old PS3 anymore, so I can't tell you how much time I spent playing the game in its entirety, but it is a vast game with so many things that you can do, and your time never really feels wasted. So, again, sorry, spoilers, head on over to the timestamp on the screen right now if you don't want to see any. Alright? Okay. Bye. John Marston is one of the most well-developed characters in any game. You think that he's just some rough-and-tumble outlaw out to get revenge on his old team after he's shot and left for dead, but he is so much more than that. You meet Bonnie, a local rancher who stumbles upon John after the whole getting shot thing, and you start to see this softness in John that you never really expected to see. He helps her and her family out on the ranch to pay them back for saving him, but you get the feeling that he's also doing it just because he wants to help. He wants to do good. And then you find out about his family and what really drives him, and it turns this grizzled and hardened man into someone more soft and relatable. Throughout the game, you start to hope that this next mission will be the last, not because you want the game to end, but because you want this outlaw, this person who has done awful things throughout their life, to have their happy ending. And that's what's so beautiful about Red Dead Redemption. When you finally get that happy ending, you play for a few more hours, just hanging out with his family and dicking around on the ranch, before it's ripped away from him. Ultimately, the Bureau couldn't give him amnesty. Like I've said, he's done terrible things. He's killed people, he's robbed people, he stood idly by while his companions did the same, and sometimes worse. But that doesn't change the emotional connection you make with John, and you do your best to fight your way through the forces the Bureau brings to your doorstep. You save John's family, getting them on horseback and ushering them off, only to swing the barn doors open to dozens of armed soldiers. You have one last moment of hope as you pull out your gun and you lock onto your enemies, taking out as many of the soldiers as you can, but ultimately, John is gunned down. Gunned down on the very ranch he fought so hard to return to in hopes of living a normal life. To separate his family from the cycle of violence that he's been participating in and perpetuating for the majority of his life. His family returns, they find him, and they bury him on the hill overlooking the ranch. And then 3 years after John's death, you play as his son, Jack, and you track down the government agent that double-crossed his father. Jack has one final confrontation, pulling his gun and killing the man in a duel, not realizing that by doing so, he's continuing to perpetuate that cycle of violence that John worked so hard throughout the story to end. Very few times has the conclusion of a game left me so conflicted. Yeah, I know John's a bad guy, I know he's done horrible things, but I still want him to have his happy ending, and seeing it torn away from him feels like a piece of me is getting torn out with it. Very few times has the conclusion of a game left me feeling so conflicted. Did I make the right choices? Am I right to sympathize with this person? Am I right to not regret whatever decision I made at the end of the game? The raw gameplay you experienced with this game, the emotional highs, and the ending that leaves you conflicted all culminate to make this one of my favorite games of the decade. Considering how similar all 6 preceding games in this franchise are, yes, 6, or 7 if you include the mobile game Betrayal, I wasn't expecting this series to take this turn at all. All of the other games were basically just go to this place, kill this god, tear minions in half, scream bloody murder, blame the gods for all your problems, repeat. But in this game, Kratos is so soft in comparison. I mean, not on like a level of raw power or anything. I mean, the first thing you do in this game is chop down a massive tree and then sling it over your shoulder like it's a friggin' twig. But on an emotional level, Kratos is almost melancholy, really. What was once this hard man who screamed at the gods and murdered them with reckless abandon is now a man that just wants to live and do right by his son. And the best part is that it's not unbelievable. The way they develop Kratos throughout this game is nothing short of astounding. He's hard on Atreus when he makes a mistake, but throughout the game he gets better at restraining himself. He hides the fact that he's a god from Atreus, and also the fact that Atreus is, in and of himself, by proxy, a god. He isn't some power-hungry fiend ripping through his enemies. Instead, he has one goal: to help his son take the ashes of his mother to the highest peak in the 9 realms. Kratos seems tired, old, and worn, though he's far from it. This is a story for his quest for redemption and reinvention, not revenge like most of the entries in the God of War franchise. Now, as a fan of Norse mythology, this setting was also just a match made in heaven for me. I wasn't sure where they'd take it or how well they'd execute it, but my gods, they nailed it. The way the gods interact with each other, the way the world is built, the way you can travel through the 9 realms and see so much of these mythological places in a relatively open world is exactly what I didn't know I wanted until Santa Monica Studios and Sony gave it to me. The combat system is so much fun. There's so much that you can do with only a few weapons and skills. Even with those limitations, I never felt restricted when I was fighting anything in this game. The fact that they axed the Blades of Chaos, one of the most iconic weapons in all of gaming for, an axe, was super risky. And honestly, I missed the Blades of Chaos up until I swung the axe for the first time. The Leviathan axe was so much fun to fight with that I didn't care they'd taken that iconic weapon away from me, where in previous games, the Blades of Chaos would just fly through opponents in a whirlwind of fire and destruction. The Leviathan axe in this one made every stroke feel deliberate and heavy. Every throw of the axe was satisfying, and every time I called it back to my hand, I found myself getting giddy at the sight of Kratos simply reaching his hand up and catching it perfectly every single time, holding it high so that his follow-up strike had that much more power behind it. Getting skills for your shield so you can bash your enemies and the sound it would make every time. Not to mention, the bosses being designed to test your knowledge of the combat system. The Valkyries in particular, while a little repetitive, were some of the best fights I've experienced in a game. This is some of the most satisfying combat I've ever had the pleasure of diving into in a video game, and it all came from taking a risk and eschewing the tradition of every other God of War game. Everything about this game was a risk for the developers at Santa Monica Studios, giving an incredibly unstable, unstoppably powerful, and unabashedly stubborn man a child and making that responsibility weigh heavily on his shoulders, completely changing the setting of the game from one piece of mythology to another, and having to make both of those mythologies interconnect and mesh, going from a fixed camera perspective game to a third-person view, putting the game in an open world, making a character who's literally known for killing gods and making him do whatever he can to avoid ever doing it again. Every single one of these risks paid off more than I ever would have hoped for, and that lands God of War a spot on this list. I love dinosaurs. I love robots. What's not to love about smashing those two things together? This game has managed to combine these two complete opposites and make it work. I mean, there isn't really any two things that I can think of that are more unalike than the giant reptiles that roam the earth before anything even remotely human came into existence, and the technology more advanced than most anything we've seen since humanity's inception. The most impressive part to me is that it's not just you fighting massive dinosaurs with modern technology, you're fighting massive dinosaurs assembled by that technology with the most basic weapons humanity has, a bow and arrow and your spear. You unlock more weapons as you go on, but none of them are incredibly advanced in any real way. Sure, you can throw lightning at creatures and lob bombs that corrupt them into fighting each other, but in the universe of the game, that's all primitive technology. In Horizon Zero Dawn, you're playing as Aloy, who was cast out of the Nora tribe at birth and raised by an outcast named Rost. Once she was old enough, she competed in the Proving to win the right to become a Nora Brave and finally become a member of the tribe, only to be ambushed and nearly killed upon winning. After this, she's given some information about her past, told that there's a cult that's learned how to corrupt machines to do their bidding, and volunteers to go out into the world and figure out what's going on. That's your introduction to this world. Guerrilla Games did a fantastic job of making this world feel real and feel lived in. The different tribes, the conversations you can just walk through and overhear, all of the little text and audio logs you find along the way that help you understand what happened in this world to leave it in such a state. The world that they built this game on the back of is absolutely incredible and intensely beautiful. If any of you watch me playing through the Frozen Wilds DLC for this game, you'll have heard me gush about how good this game looks to an almost annoying degree. It's one of the most breathtaking games ever made. I could spend hours just traversing through this game. It's that gorgeous and that fun. It's like the developers just looked at the best parts of open world gaming and tossed them all into one game. Even the concept behind what makes the main character Aloy unique to the rest of her people is such a simple thing when you think about it. One piece of technology, a focus, that gives her special perceptive abilities. That's really it. But it opens up the world in combat in a way that I haven't really seen done before in a video game. Sure, you can go in bows blazing and just kill everything in sight, or you can use your focus, discover the machine's patrol routes, and go through the areas without harming anything. Hell, even if you're preparing for a fight, you can scan your enemy and find out what their weaknesses are and have a better understanding of what you can do to have an edge in the fight. Are you fighting a rock breaker? Maybe instead of trying to smack it with your spear whenever it pops out of the ground like a glorified game of whack-a-mole, you prevent it from being able to dig by using a weapon with a tear property to destroy its digging arms, thereby preventing it from being able to avoid you. Maybe you grab your weapon that deals the most damage and wait for it to rear its head back so you can shoot its fuel sack and cause an explosion that burns it for a while after. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for combat in this game, and if you're like me and you enjoy overthinking your strategies, this combat system is perfectly suited for you. If you just want to go through the game beating everything over the head with a spear and going in bows blazing, I mean, this is perfectly suited for you too. This game has great potential replay value. There's very little about this game that I think detracts from it. Some of the armor sets are incredibly specific and weird looking, inventory management in the early game can get a little tedious, and the characters' faces can be a little lifeless in a lot of the dialogue scenes, but those are minuscule complaints in comparison to all of the things this game excels at. In fact, I originally had this game at number 10 because of those flaws, but as I wrote the script, I realized that, yeah, those things aren't great, but the rest of this game is so fucking good that I don't care. If you have a PS4 and you haven't already, do yourself a favor and play this game. You will not be disappointed. What happens when one of the most influential developers of our current generation of gaming takes their tried and true method and turns certain aspects of it on its head? You get Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, and by far my favorite game of all of the ones that we've played together this year. I still remember the first teaser they put out for this game, and just how many people were theorizing over what this game would end up being. People were saying it would be anything from Bloodborne 2 to a new Tenchu game. From Software has built such a massive fan base, and that fan base cares tremendously about damn near everything the studio puts out, and considering their track record, it's well deserved. Sekiro is FromSoft's most recent game, and is one of their best to be sure. It takes the tried and true format of the Souls series and tweaks it to the point where I don't honestly think we could accurately classify this as a Souls-like. You still have some of the core basics of a Souls-like game. The Sculptor's Idols take the place of bonfires, you get to use materials you find in the world to upgrade your arm, much like upgrading weapons, and giving gourd seeds to Emma upgrades her healing gourd, like trading in Estus shards upgrades your Estus flask. But other than that, most of it is vastly different. I mean, you can jump, for one, and early on, you gain access to your prosthetic arm that you can then use to grapple to points in your surroundings. You can crouch down and sneak through tall grass, hug the sides of walls to remain unseen, and then take your enemies out from that stealthy position. It's possible to get through many of the areas unseen with just those two mechanics alone. Now, this is slightly spoilery, but you also eventually get a prosthetic that allows you to lock onto one target and lure them to you, allowing for even more stealth takedowns in situations where your enemies are grouped up. Speaking of prosthetics, the amount of different tools at your disposal are crazy, and the different versions of all the different tools gives you so many options to approach any combat with. No single tool is useless, and sometimes getting creative and changing up what you're currently using might just be the best way to get past that stubborn boss you've been stuck on for hours. Oh, and the bosses! Oh my god, this game boasts 14 of the best bosses I have fought in any video game. The only one I wasn't huge on was the folding screen monkeys, but even then I thought it was a good attempt at a puzzle boss. It wasn't just something you could beat your head against and eventually get, you had to outsmart the game to beat it. It's just that outsmarting it wasn't terribly difficult in this case. And even then, I enjoyed the fight, so that's more a nitpick than anything. Aside from bosses, the mini-bosses are also so much fun to go up against. Sure, some of them get repetitive, but the challenge was still immensely rewarding when you figured out the little tricks to break their posture and land that killing blow. Ooh, and posture. Oh, when I first heard about FromSoft getting rid of stamina and introducing posture, my skepticism grew, and I wasn't sure about what this game would be like, but posture is so well integrated into the game that it quickly became one of my favorite parts about it. You pretty quickly realize that you don't need or really want a stamina bar in this game because the fights all flow so beautifully. Almost like they're a rhythm game. Learning attack patterns and being able to counter every movement your enemy makes perfectly, knowing exactly how many cuts you can get in after a certain attack, knowing when you need to hit that block button to get your consecutive deflections perfect, and just wreak havoc on the enemy's posture is all immensely satisfying. I remember seeing the long-armed centipede giraffe for the first time and being absolutely terrified. Now whenever I run to him, I just count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. You just learn the rhythm of your enemy, learn the timing of your blocks, and execute. Oh, and deflections was one of the most satisfying mechanics to play with as well. Hearing that clang of swords as you time your block perfectly, seeing your enemy's posture shoot up with every consecutive one, it's just such a satisfying mechanic, and it encourages you to be in the thick of things, fighting whatever enemy is in front of you, staying in their face and not giving them a moment to breathe. And then once you get skill points, the game changes yet again. I remember how much of a pain in the ass any enemy with a spear was until I got the Makiri counter ability, and then I remember how trivial every enemy with a spear was after. The progression of your skills in this game is bewildering. Running through areas early on and struggling only to come back in an hour with a new tool in your arsenal and trivializing the entire section is amazing. It's at this point I realize all I've been gushing about is the mechanics, but this game has probably the best combat in any game I've ever played so far. No game beats this in level of satisfaction you get from combat in my eyes. It's varied enough that you can play through this game dozens of times and take a different approach every time. The story is a pretty thrilling tale as well, but I mean, I can't say much about it without spoiling things, and I'm trying not to spoil things as much as I can. I know that 2 of them are really heavy on spoilers, so I want to make up for it now. But if there's one thing that I want to point out, it's how you get to see such small details to mark your progression throughout the game. In the first battle, we see that Sekiro is rusty as he fumbles reaching for his blade. In another cutscene later on in the game, he reaches for his sword much more efficiently, but he still stumbles a bit. But by the time we reach the end of the game, he reaches and pulls out his katana in one smooth motion, showing the progression and mastery of the sword that he's attained to this point. And also, your mastery of the game. FromSoft is the master of subtle storytelling, and this is one more beautifully told story worth experiencing. But speaking of FromSoft,
whatever happens, you may think it all a mere bad dream.
oh, this game. Oh my god, this game. Bloodborne was one of the earliest games to come out on PS4, and of the catalog of games that come out specifically for it, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with one that I love more than this. Bloodborne is damn near a perfect game in my eyes. The brilliant combination of gothic and cosmic horror, the way the game rewards you for being aggressive, the deep lore, the subtle nods to FromSoft's other works, the weapons, the bosses, and even a lot of the basic enemies. There's hardly anything about this game that I would complain about. One minute you're putzing around Yharnam slaying blood-drunk hunters and beasts, and the next minute you're fighting these massive Lovecraftian entities, wondering what the connection between the two are. The way they tie everything together is absolutely brilliant storytelling, but that storytelling isn't told in a traditional manner. While most games will hold your hand to a certain degree, and at the very least tell you what the story you're playing through is all about, without you having to go out and find it, Bloodborne takes a very different approach. You can piece together a bit of the story by watching cutscenes and noting the names of bosses you encounter, But to really get any sort of true understanding of what's going on, you're gonna have to do some digging on your own. How do you dig for that information? You pay attention to the appearance of the world around you, and you read item descriptions. Now, sure, this form of storytelling isn't everyone's cup of tea, and even the way I just described it makes it sound tedious and boring, but I can't describe how satisfying it is to me to find an item and to be able to theorize what its deeper connection to the world around you is. There were so many times playing this game that I picked up an item after hours and hours of playing, and something just suddenly clicked, only to result in me going to look up to see if other people had made the same connection and finding that there's even more evidence that supports my seemingly batshit insane theory. It makes all of the work you've put in to find these details so worthwhile, and there is so much detail in this game, it is unreal. Story and lore aside, the gameplay is hugely satisfying. One of the things that this game does that's almost completely unique to it is the rally system, where you have a small window of time after being hit to strike back at your enemy and gain that health back. You're rewarded for being aggressive. The game's combat is based around it. When you first get your gear, you're given a weapon and you're given a gun. There's no blocking at all. Well, I mean, there is a shield that you can pick up, but the description FromSoft gives it basically tells you this item is useless, you're going to need to play aggressively to win here. For a game that's notoriously difficult, that can be a bit daunting, and at first, I definitely had to overcome my reflex response to stay on the outskirts of the fight and only take shots when I get a massive opening. A lot of bosses don't really give you that opening. You have to know where to position yourself, learn their timing, get that shot off at the perfect time so you can parry your enemy. You need to be assertive. You need to be up in their face. And with the large assortment of completely unique trick weapons the game gives you, you have so many options for how to go about that. Trick weapons are also one of the coolest things I've seen in any game. What's that? You want to use a cane to fight everything? What if you can also transform that cane into a bladed whip to give yourself a little extra reach? Oh, you want just a regular sword? What if we make the scabbard a massive rock and give you a sword and a ridiculously large hammer? Oh, you want a mace? Well, what if we give you a serrated pizza cutter attachment that you can add to the end and use like a lawnmower to cut down your enemies like overgrown grass? Every weapon in this game is ridiculously cool with its own specific moveset and transformation. Gone are the days of weapons that are in the same class with the same moves, where the only real difference is that some have larger numbers, and in are the days where every weapon is wholly unique. With maybe 2 exceptions, this game has some of my all-time favorite boss fights, and the arenas for those fights are fucking incredible. Running through a castle and figuring out all of the puzzles to find a gnarled old man sitting in his throne at the highest point, seeing a cutscene play out, making him come back to life just to fight you and keep you from uncovering the secrets of this place. Fighting him on a rooftop, navigating around the spires, and trying your best not to get too close to the edge just in case you can be knocked off. There's no words to accurately describe that apart from badass. Add to that the fact that you can do completely different builds for every playthrough and take on these bosses in completely different ways, and you have incredible potential for replayability. This game is unbelievably good, and I genuinely think that anyone with a PS4 without this game is doing themselves a disservice. The only real way that I can think to define this game is to call it the best space opera ever written. Period. Number 3. Just kidding, obviously. I mean, I definitely do believe Mass Effect 2 is the best space opera ever written, but I can go on for days about it. I mean, if you couldn't tell by how long all of these have been so far. I still remember most of my first playthrough of Mass Effect 2, and some minor spoilers are to follow here, but it's nothing that you wouldn't find out within the first 15 minutes of the game anyways. I was still reeling from the events of Mass Effect 1, and I was wondering how BioWare was going to top it, and then that first cutscene plays. And I'll be honest, I was a little pissed at first. I thought that BioWare had pulled one over on us by putting Commander Shepard on all of the promotional material, only to kill him off and then replace them with a brand new protagonist. But then you see them getting brought back to life, and you get to the character customization screen, and from just that moment alone, I knew I was gonna love this game. 10 minutes of cutscene was all it took to get me hooked on this game. cutscene. And then you get into the game, you start exploring the universe, you start meeting all of your party members, some old and some new, and you learn about their stories. Every party member of the Normandy SR2 has an incredible story that you can't help but want to uncover, and every single one of them feels so real. You can understand the motivations every one of them has, and you get legitimately attached to them. I'd be lying if I said I had an easy time deciding on who to take with me on missions, because I wanted to hear every bit of dialogue these characters had, not just with me or with other NPCs throughout the world that you encounter, but with each other too. Those little back and forths make this game so unique. The combat in the first game felt a little bit clunky, like BioWare was still figuring out what exactly they wanted to do with it, but Mass Effect 2 had no such problems. They nailed the gameplay mechanics of this one, rushing into combat, ducking behind cover, popping up and taking pot shots at your enemies while trying to figure out how to best use you and your team's abilities was some of the most fun I've ever had. The combinations of effects you could have, how vastly different you could build each of your party members, and all of the different party combinations you have access to gives you an almost unlimited amount of variety and replayability. One of the things that BioWare has always done well and did best in this game is having a morality system. The Paragon versus Renegade system is absolutely iconic in video games, and this particular entry is the best example of it in my eyes. Sure, it doesn't necessarily impact the ending of the game, but oh my god, does it feel good to just go full renegade sometimes. There's so many options for it, and you genuinely feel either feared or respected when navigating through the world, depending on the dialogue options that you take. I always do a couple of playthroughs of games like these when I have the time. One where I'm as nice as possible, and one where I'm a proper fucking bastard. It's another one of those things that just adds so much to the experience of the game, unless you play it over and over and over again, because no two playthroughs are alike. I won't talk too much about the story, since I want to avoid spoiling things where I can, but I really need to emphasize that this is probably one of my favorite space-based stories ever written. Bungie did a great job with the Halo series, but in my opinion, BioWare outclasses them in every way. I love Halo. This isn't a dig at those games saying I think they're bad. Hell, Halo 3 is one of my favorite games of all time. All that this is meant to portray is the level of respect I have for the story of Mass Effect, and Mass Effect 2 answers so many questions you have from the first one, while positing even more potentially dire revelations to be seen in the third, which we won't talk about. I mean, I didn't hate it as much as other people did, but it certainly dropped the ball. Mass Effect 2 tells one of the most poignant, uplifting, and intricate stories ever thrown into the medium, and I would be lying if I said it didn't make me tear up on multiple occasions. And not all of those occasions were because of sadness. I don't know why, but I'm more likely to cry when emotions are high and really badass and cool things are happening than when there's something sad going on. I mean, those scenes still get to me, and there's a fair few in this game that do, but I shed so many tears of just elated joy playing this game that it would be a disservice to it not to mention. Mass Effect 2, you are an awe-inspiring story with beautiful visuals, characters, and subversions of my expectations. You're a standout game in my all-time favorites and a standout game of this decade in gaming. Replayability is really important to me in a game. In all honesty, it's why a few of the games above beat out a lot of the honorable mentions. Games that have so many twists and turns can lose replay value because once you've seen it, it loses all of that emotional impact every single time you witness it again afterwards. The Last of Us isn't really a game that has a ton of replay potential, and zombies were a bit of an overused trope even when this game came out, but this story is on a completely different level to almost any other piece of media in general. Naughty Dog's story here makes zombies almost seem like something that could potentially exist at some point in our reality, which to me makes them a legitimately terrifying concept. They managed to take an overused enemy type that you become used to slaying by the hundreds in games like Left 4 Dead and make them an absolutely horrifying thing to fight, even just one-on-one. My skin still crawls when I hear the distinct sound of a clicker in the distance, knowing that one of them could end Joel, our protagonist's life, with ease. This game doesn't just emphasize stealth, it requires it. You're in a post-apocalyptic world with very few resources. You can't just go in guns blazing and hope for the best because you have no idea what's waiting for you around the next corner. There's always such a tense atmosphere, even when you're just sat there chatting with people. It feels like you're always in danger, you're never safe, and there's nothing you can really do to truly be safe. Hell, even when the zombies aren't out to get you, people are fighting and killing each other over what little resources remain. There is almost no time when you're playing this game that you feel truly at ease. And now again, to really get into what makes this game as good as it is, I've got to get into spoiler territory. So if you don't want to see that, head over to the timestamp on your screen, wrap me out. The game starts with a scene of Sarah, Joel's daughter, waking up on the couch while Joel is on the phone with her uncle. Then he sits down, and Sarah gives him a birthday present, a new watch, and jokes about how she got the money for it selling hardcore drugs. And her and Joel have a little back and forth before she falls asleep, and he carries her up to her room. Right off the bat, you know how much they love each other and how much they depend on each other. It takes all of 5 minutes for you to fall in love with this family and start rooting for them. But you realize the problem right away. Sarah's not the girl from the box art of the game. You know something has to happen, and the game wastes no time getting there. You start playing as Sarah after she's woken up by a phone call from her uncle. You start exploring the house a little bit, finding more little trinkets and mementos that show you how much love exists in this family. She goes downstairs and you see a bunch of police cars rushing past the house. She heads over to the study, and Joel runs into the house covered in blood. He grabs his gun, saying that the neighbor is sick, only to have the neighbor in question run in, bursting through the glass door and stopping briefly before charging at Joel and Sarah, and consequently being shot down. The blood is starting to pump now, and the anticipation of what's coming is getting to you. Uncle Tommy pulls up in the driveway and you hop in, weaving through the chaos on the streets. Overturned cars, dead bodies, these seemingly insane people charging at and eating others. Fires, looting, gunshots, the work. A car crashes into them, breaking Sarah's leg and forces them to continue on foot. Joel picks up his daughter and starts running through the town trying to get to safety. They run towards the highway, coming upon a soldier, and then this happens.
Got a couple of civilians in the outer perimeter. Please advise.
Daddy, what about Uncle Tommy?
We're gonna get you to safety and go back for him, okay?
Sir, there's a little girl. But... Yes, sir.
Somebody, we've just been through hell. Okay, we just need... Shit. Please don't.
Oh no.
Sarah. Move your hands, baby. I know, baby, I know. Listen to me, I know this hurts, baby. You're gonna be okay, baby. Stay with me. All right, I'm gonna pick you up. I know, baby, I know it hurts. Come on, baby, please. I know, baby, I know. Sarah. Baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Don't do this to me, baby. Come on. Come on. No. No. No, no, no. Please. 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 Please don't. Please.
7 years later and I still cry. The scene gave me chills. We're 20 minutes in, and this game has me fucking weeping. Then it cuts to 20 years later, and you see a grizzled, old Joel, and you don't need anything in the game to tell you that he hasn't gotten over the death of Sarah, other than the fact that he's still wearing the watch that she got him all those years ago. This is nothing short of a masterpiece in storytelling. Joel meeting Ellie, this little girl that's been bitten but is seemingly immune to the infection, and potentially humanity's only hope at ever bouncing back. Joel completely rejects her at first, and then slowly grows more and more attached to her until she becomes his surrogate daughter. Seeing that same love and affection that Joel had with Sarah, you're overwhelmed with joy to finally see this broken man given something good in his life. And then Naughty Dog hits you with another gut punch. You get through the entire game, you see this relationship progress in every way you'd hoped it would, and you find out that in order to save humanity, Ellie needs to die. They can't just take a blood sample. They need to remove the infected portion of her to reverse engineer a vaccine, but that infected portion is in her brain, and there's no way to retrieve that without killing her. Joel's lost one daughter already, and you can be damn sure he's not losing another. Even knowing that the fate of humanity hangs in the balance, Joel can't overcome his selfish desire to be with Ellie. He kills dozens of people, kills everyone in the operating room, and steals Ellie away, assuredly dooming humanity in the process. Joel, our protagonist, turns out to be a selfish, cowardly man, incapable of doing something for the greater good. And after seeing what he's been through, after seeing him and Ellie get to genuinely love each other and find happiness in each other's company, I honestly can't say I'd do anything differently. Before playing this game, if you'd have asked me if I'd be capable of sacrificing someone that I love deeply to save humanity, I'd have said yes without a second thought. But after seeing this story, after seeing how deep those connections can go, and after this video game forced me to confront these questions, not as a hypothetical, but as a literal question, I'd honestly probably do the same as Joel. This game makes you feel conflicted. At the end of it, you're sure that you've made the wrong decision, but you're still glad you made that decision. And those two conflicting concepts make you feel almost uneasy. This is probably the first game I've ever played that made me sit down afterwards and question my own morality. What would I have done? Could I rightly say I wouldn't do the same given the circumstances? This game affected me on a fucking personal level, and I know so many other people had that too. I mean, seriously, if you've never played The Last of Us, you are missing out on one of the greatest stories ever told, period. This was incredibly hard for me to put into second place, if I'm completely honest. If you were to ask me what my favorite game is, it would be Nier Automata. If you were to ask me what my favorite video game soundtrack is, it would be Nier Automata. Favorite story? Nier. Favorite themes? Nier. Favorite gameplay? Nier. Favorite characters? Nier. Favorite Easter eggs? Nier. Everything about this game hit the right notes for me. The multiple endings, the choices, the philosophical quandaries you face when playing through it, the world building, the rich story, the soundtrack. Everything about this game makes me sit back and utter one word more often than any other in my vocabulary. Wow. I don't think I can oversell this game because it changed what video games represent to me. People are losing their minds over Hideo Kojima saying that Death Stranding was a game made with the idea of bringing people together in a community as the core concept. But nearly 3 years before Death Stranding came out, Yoko Taro had beaten him to the punch with Nier Automata. The ending of this game, the true ending of the game, is one of the most tragically beautiful endings to a story I've ever seen. You know what? Fuck that. It is the most tragically beautiful ending to a story I've ever seen. I think one of the reasons that Nier hit so close to home for me as well is because of the soundtrack. Keiichi Okabe made sure every song was composed perfectly for the situation it's introduced in. Every song flows perfectly into another when you transition from one area to the next. And the fact that they made 8-bit versions of every song just for when you're hacking into machines is such an incredibly unnecessary thing for the developers to have done, but is one of an incredible amount of fine details that elevate this game's status from a great game to one of the best games ever made. I get goosebumps whenever I hear the end credits song come on while I'm driving. I remember fights and traversing through the world when the tracks associated come on and I have my iPod on shuffle. There were times when I wasn't streaming the game where I would literally just relax by going to different areas and fishing, just sitting there, listening to the music play in quiet contemplation. Never has a soundtrack fit so well with a piece of art, except for maybe the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, but I think Howard Shore is an absolute master of composition. But in all honesty, I think Keiichi Okabe is at the very least on the same level. The music isn't just in the background of the game. Sometimes it's integral to the scene and what's going on. One boss battle in particular stands out in this respect. The music lines up with their moves, and learning the timing in the music helps you learn the timing of the boss. It's nothing short of a masterpiece of a soundtrack. When you finish the first playthrough, and you think you have everything figured out, you complete your second playthrough, and you question literally everything that you thought that you had figured out. And then you finish your third playthrough, and you're questioning even more. Almost every ending reveals a little more about the world, and it's well worth getting all 26. Sure, some are kind of throwaway jokes that don't really mean anything in the greater narrative, but even those endings show you how much thought went into making this. And honestly, a lot of those more throwaway endings are absolutely hilarious. Nier Automata combines so many genres of gaming. There's third-person hack and slash, there's vertical, horizontal, and isometric bullet hell, there's open-world exploration, there's RPG character progress, there's a run-and-gun side-scrolling, and there's 2D fighter game styles. I'm missing a few. I know for sure I am. It's like playing a 90s version of Metal Slug mixed with Breath of the Wild and Street Fighter and Devil May Cry and Enter the Gungeon with an incredibly emotionally driven narrative. The only real negative I have to give this game is that some of the bullet hell portions have so much going on visually that it's nearly impossible to keep track of what exactly is happening on screen. And even then, those bullet hells are few and far between. So when those bullet hell scenes aren't happening, and there's not so much going on the screen, I fail to think of any other game that legitimately took my breath away with the designs and the music and their set pieces. Walking into Pascal's village for the first time and seeing this beautiful little treehouse with robots singing to you as you enter is one of those moments in gaming where all I can think was, yep, yeah, I love this. I love everything about this. This story is absolutely phenomenal. I don't think I can sell that enough. It's tragic, hopeful, happy, and sad. It's heartwarming and heartbreaking. It's a thought-provoking dive into existentialism and whether artificial intelligence would ever be able to achieve what makes us human. Is being human our ability to experience emotion and philosophize? If an artificial intelligence were able to do those things, are they human? If they're not human in spite of being capable of those things, then what truly does it mean to be human? I personally think the best philosophical quandary to put forward as a basis for the story is one thing Jean-Paul says during your conversations with him, which is also quoting the French philosopher and father of existentialism, Jean-Paul. Existence precedes essence. Essence would be defined as the nature of any given thing, so if you consider a chair, we can understand its nature or essence by listing its properties and examining the purpose for which it's been created. The nature of a chair exists in the world before it's made to exist. But with humanity, how could that possibly apply? Our existence comes long before we know our own nature. Within the setting of the game, these robots were made with a specific purpose in mind. But that purpose is now gone, and they're starting to find their own nature or essence. Under this one philosophical statement, are they not then human? This is probably the biggest theme in Nier Automata, but it's far from the only one. You need only look at the names of many of the characters to discover how deep these roots actually go. Pascal, Simone, Emmanuel, Kierkegaard, hell, even 2B is a reference to Shakespeare. None of this is even really spoilery. There's so much depth here. It's one of the many concepts this game explores. Plus, the fan service is... what was I saying? I cannot possibly recommend this game enough. I could go on about it for days. It's my favorite game of all time, no questions asked. But it's not the best game of the decade. But before we get to the best game of the decade, here's a list of honorable mentions that I really had to nitpick to find reasons not to include them in the top 10.
Hallelujah.
It's been a long time. How have you been?
Hey, you. You're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border, right? Walked right into that Imperial ambush.
And now with all those out of the way, here's number 1.
Thus began the Age of Fire.
There was really only one game that could possibly come on top of this list in my eyes. Even with how much I love Nier and the other games on this list, I cannot deny the impact that Dark Souls has had, not only on games of its own genre, but on the gaming industry as a whole. I only ever made it to Anne Orlando before putting this game down, and I keep meaning to pick it back up, but I don't think I need to have beaten it to recognize it deserves the #1 spot as the greatest game of the decade. The gameplay is more than a little clunky, and the visuals are dated even for their time, where they were only middling at best. The game was rushed out at the end of production, resulting in an area of the game being left unfinished, but other than that, it's hard to find faults. And with everything this game nails, I can hardly complain about those points. Demon Souls introduced a new kind of storytelling, and a new kind of difficulty, and a new kind of world building, and Hidetaka Miyazaki honed all of that to near perfection in Dark Souls. Demon Souls came first, but Dark Souls was the one that elevated the series to an entirely new genre in gaming that people didn't know they were craving. Dark Souls is absolutely 100% pure game. It's fantastically dark and fascinating, and pays no mind to what the widely accepted concept of what a video game was meant to be at the time. Instead of creating a story where you're ultimately the good guy at the end of it all, they made a bleak and uncertain ending where you're left doubting yourself. Instead of holding your hand to the story and spoon-feeding you everything you want to know, they make you read item descriptions and piece everything together yourself. Instead of throwing incredibly easy enemies at you to demonstrate the game's mechanics, they toss you into a boss room within the first 5 minutes of booting up the game, before you've even gotten any of your equipment. This game does nothing to hold your hand or to protect you from failure, and FromSoft turned all of these things from just gameplay mechanics into an art form in and of itself. Bosses go from being a bit of a challenge to near anxiety-inducing. Swarms go from easily mowed down to terrifyingly vicious. You will die. You will die a lot. You'll get cut down, burned to death, eaten. I mean, hell, your biggest enemy oftentimes is gravity when you're panicking in combat and accidentally roll yourself off of a cliff. There's no real central hub you can retreat to where enemies can't follow, only bonfires along the way, and sometimes spaced out in a way that makes you think the devs want you to quit. But in those moments where you're rewarded for all the time you spent learning the mechanics, learning a boss's moveset, learning to navigate fluidly throughout the world to reach that next bonfire and get that new checkpoint, it's one of the most euphoric moments I have ever experienced in gaming. The world that was created in this game is immense, and the lore runs deeper than most any game I've ever seen. So deep that this game birthed an online community like no other that discusses everything from the importance of any given item in the game's lore to different strategies for the myriad of bosses to even just what armor and weapons they think look the best. This game inadvertently created the most connected online community of gamers that I think there has ever been. Is that the largest community? Not by a long shot. I'm sure Call of Duty has a bigger following, but the community for Dark Souls is remarkably tight-knit and close, and boasts some of the most respectful discourse I've ever seen. Well, besides all the get good memeing, but I think you get my drift. The cultural impact of Dark Souls is so prominent, even people that have never played a Souls game in their entire lives will likely recognize designs from the game, if not jokes about specific parts. If someone utters the phrase, "Praise the sun," I'm willing to bet a majority of gamers would know what that's referencing and where it comes from. Dark Souls is possibly the most culturally pervasive game ever created. The bosses are amazing, with very few exceptions. I remember how terrified I was when I first unknowingly entered the Asylum Demon's boss room, before the game had even given me a weapon or a way to heal myself. I remember panicking as I walked across the bridge and Taurus Demon jumped down in front of me to block my path. I remember walking into Ornstein and Smo's arena saying, "Oh, that fat guy doesn't look so bad," and then grimacing in horror as Ornstein leapt from his balcony to join his companion in a 2-on-1 fight. With very few exceptions, every boss is terrifically designed and unique, and every one of them feels fresh and exciting. The music elevates these fights from pants-shittingly terrifying to pants-shittingly terrifying, but also epic. The music subtly personifies what these bosses are all about, from the Bell Gargoyle's Castlevania-esque use of staccato harpsichord, to the big, booming brass section of Ceaseless Discharge, to the somber, reflective piano melody of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. The soundtrack does an amazing job of setting the tone for every fight you find yourself in. The music alone lets you know what you should be feeling, from a climactic conflict of clashing swords to an uneasy feeling that what you're battling is only fulfilling its duty, and that its death is unwarranted in the grand scheme of things. Not every battle makes you feel good about what you're doing. Sif, Artorias, Gwyn. The music alone makes you feel like some sort of tragedy is taking place, but for whatever reason, you must press on. Dark Souls may not be the most technically impressive game, It may not tell the most amazing story, it may not have the best soundtrack or designs, but no other game in this decade, maybe even of the 21st century so far, has shook the industry as much as it. If you look at this list, there's at least 2 games that I'd argue wouldn't exist were it not for Dark Souls. Bloodborne and Sekiro most likely would never have been created. The same could be said for Nioh, Code Vein, The Surge, Hyper Light Drifter, Salt and Sanctuary, Ashen, Hollow Knight, and so many more. And hell, those are just games that were the most directly influenced by it. You could argue that mechanics people enjoy from other games might not be the same without it either. The list is insanely long. Dark Souls isn't just a game. Dark Souls is a cultural phenomenon. It stands as a testament to what games can be, and how one piece of fiction can change the landscape of an industry, and how it can give rise to an incredible, dedicated community of people across the world. Dark Souls is, in my mind, one of the greatest pieces of fiction ever created, and the most important game of the decade. And there it is, my top 10 games of the decade. This video ended up being way longer than I ever anticipated it being, and I'm legitimately starting to lose my voice from recording this all in one day like a fucking idiot. Now, I know people are going to disagree, obviously, and I couldn't include every game that I wanted to, even in the honorable mentions, but I feel like I was able to reason these choices out relatively well, at least to myself. I had to get super nitpicky to make this list, which is why the honorable mentions section is more games than are even in the top 10. I had 12 games, I think, in the honorable mentions. Like, Doki Doki subverted my expectations of the visual novel genre at almost every turn and told a story I've never seen before, but there's not really any gameplay that makes it so you can replay it after having seen the story once. Breath of the Wild was some of the most fun I've had navigating through an open world. The shrines were a ton of fun, I really liked the combat, and the artwork is amazing. But the story was your run-of-the-mill Legend of Zelda that I didn't really engage with, the bosses were all disappointing, the inventory system could get downright frustrating, and the enemy variety was severely lacking in my eyes. I love those games, but that's just an example of the detail I had to go into to decide what made it and what didn't. I also had to exclude games that I'm only kind of getting into now, or that I haven't played enough of to have a fully formed opinion. Like, I just started playing Death Stranding as of recording this video, and I'm almost 100% sure it's gonna make it into the top 10 for me, but I can't realistically put it in there yet because I haven't played enough of it. With all that being said, what were your top 10 games of the decade? Is there a game you think I forgot about? Toss them in the comments below, and while you're down there, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and click that bell for notifications and make sure you can actually see when we're streaming and uploading. That's it for me today, guys. So thank you everybody for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, a fantastic year, and a fantastic decade. We'll see you next time.